This is KVR, Kaijuvision Radio. Hello, Kaiju and tokusatsu fans, and welcome to Kaijuvision Radio, a podcast about the appreciation of Kaiju and tokusatsu movies and discovering their historical and cultural value. I'm Brian Scherschel. In this episode, I'm going to be giving you my very brief rundown of G-Fest XXV, and then we will proceed with the interview that I had with our special guest, Kevin Derendorf. The convention had a huge turnout. 3,000 people for an interest of this scale is really impressive. I wasn't feeling really well a lot of the time that weekend. Traveling really took a lot out of me. I slept well, though, once I got home. I met so many people that weekend, and it was great. Friendly atmosphere, so much going on at the convention. Never a dull moment. First, I'll talk about Peggy Neal. What an amazing person to meet. Her panel was excellent, too, because she told us about her life story, being an actress and a model. I was so glad that she and Avery Guerrera came to G-Fest. His movie he directed, The Great Buddha Arrival, was screened at G-Fest. Peggy talked about her time making the movies that she starred in, mainly X from Outer Space, which was screened at G-Fest, and Terror Beneath the Sea. Her telling us how she was raised as a Buddhist in Japan made me want to become a Buddhist myself. She's so emotionally centered and peaceful. Going to her interview was wonderful, and I hope she returns to G-Fest soon. There is a link to the full panel that she did on Kaijuvision's social media. Next, I'll move to Akira Takarada. I met him that weekend, like so many others did. He's so personable and warm, and he's a perfect gentleman. I was captivated by his story of his time at the end of the Great Pacific War, when Soviet soldiers shot and killed his brother and almost killed him too. You could feel the audience connecting to him emotionally and understanding his struggle in that moment. His remarks about how he's apolitical and for peace and understanding were very enlightening at a time when the negative aspects of politics seem to be so disheartening. There are many people who I'm so in awe of them that I can barely stutter a complete sentence when I meet them. But I was so overwhelmed. I told Mr. Takarada, thanks so much for everything. You're an inspiration, and that's all I could get out. Check the video on Facebook or Twitter for the huge crowd that it was on his interview. The man is a living legend. Next, I'll talk about the Anime Trilogy panel. I was one of 5 people on the Anime Trilogy panel on Sunday. Check YouTube or Kaijuvision.com, and you can see the entire panel on video. It was good. Despite the conventional wisdom that the Anime Trilogy is universally hated, I met quite a few people at the convention who liked them, or at least they said that there were redeeming factors. I don't have much to say other than that the audience got a lot out of it, and it was probably one of the best panels I've seen at G-Fest. Kaijuvision had its own panel at G-Fest. I want to thank Taylor Hensley from the Giant Monster Messages podcast for joining me on the panel. We compared and contrasted alien invasions and Godzilla movies versus American movies. Alien invasion movies can be really revealing because they show us what the fears of the society it created in has. It's also on YouTube in full. Check it out. I absolutely loved it because I got to talk about Japanese history. So anyway, both panels are up now on YouTube, and now the last part of G-Fest that I'm releasing is the interview of Kevin Derendorf, writer of the book Kaiju for Hipsters and the man in charge at the Mazer Patrol podcast. Enjoy. You're listening to KVR Kaijuvision Radio. With us, we have Kevin Derendorf.
Hey, glad to be here.
And I've been wanting to see you for a couple years now because I've known your name, and I got 2 interviews through last year, and I thought, dang it, I didn't get Kevin.
All right.
So I'm glad to have you here at G-Fest 26. What a good conference this is, and it's fun. I love it. It's so entertaining sometimes, just in ways that you don't originally anticipate.
So G-Fest is my favorite convention of all of them. I've gone to a great number of them. I've gone to anime conventions, I've gone to horror conventions, I've gone to sci-fi conventions, and G-Fest is just, I mean, it's cliche because everybody says it is like a family reunion, but that's because it's true that you run into people that you know, and you run into people that you haven't seen in a while, and it's just you get on immediately. And the guests at G-Fest are so much nicer and more accessible than the other conventions, and it's fantastic because the scope is so small, that also helps tremendously, because everybody sort of speaks the same language. I feel like so many conventions you go to are just a place to go buy Funko Pops, and this is not that at all.
Yeah, it's intimate, it's accessible, it's really special. And I mean, all of the kaiju and toku world is special, and I truly believe that they're in the gene that is novelty seeking. Like, there's some genes that people have that actually encourage novelty seeking, and what better novelty than Japan and Godzilla and Kaiju? I mean, it's such a great way to satisfy that urge.
It's a well that you will not exhaust. There's always new things coming out. There's always old things that you haven't discovered, and that is why it's tremendously rewarding to be a fan of this material, because I still will pick up, old issues of Uchusen or something, and they'll be talking about some movie, and I'll be like, I've never heard of this movie, and I'll go online and be like, hey, has anyone heard of this movie? Nobody's heard of it. Like, well, it came out on VHS, and everybody looks together to see if we can find a copy. Yeah, it's sort of amazing, because whether it's language barrier or just time, especially the stuff that was around before the internet, a lot of it is just completely not known about, and that makes it a bit of an adventure.
Absolutely. I know you've done a lot of interviews regarding your book, which is Kaiju for Hipsters 101, Alternative Giant Monster Movies. What is the thing that people assume about hearing that title? I imagine they probably assume it's about Godzilla.
I think a lot of people do. It's something I don't know if people necessarily what they envision. I mean, I definitely had people come up and say like, "Oh, this is a cringeworthy title," and I'm like, "Okay, well, let's." Too late now, and there are the people that come up and they start skimming through it, and they're like, "This is why you're talking about Pacific Rim, and that's not obscure enough." And the main thrust of the book is, Godzilla movies are specifically what I wanted to not talk about, because everybody has talked about Godzilla movies, and I don't want to be the person that watches the DVD of Godzilla vs. Megalon, listens to the commentary, and then writes up the things I learned in the commentary, because anyone can do that. So.
And just regurgitate it back out, and it's cut and dry, just over and done with, and there it is. It sits there, and I think the term that I'm a big Hitchcock fan. The term Hitchcock used with people was the story is stillborn. It's just sitting there. It's not going anywhere, and it's just not moving. And if you don't have any original thought to add to it, then what really do you have at the end of the day? It's just same old. And when I looked at these Godzilla movies, I was like, man, I want to be able to bang these out once a week and build up a few episodes before, so we got some buffer there, and then just go with it, because I already got a format that was like overly intensively perfectionist, but once it was put together, it's like, okay, now we can just run with it,
right?
Just do the same thing every time, and yet not, because it's a different issue, it's a different movie, and yet it's enough fresh stuff in it that we can add something to the conversation. And that's what I like about what your mission here with this was. I mean, you're going off the beaten path, basically. You're going for the obtuse, the obscure, and the next level, and you got to keep going. And Godzilla is, while at the same time it's not old hat, depending on what perspective you take, but so often that path has been used so much and traveled so often that it gets harder and harder. And when I was like, okay, let's try foreign policy, international relations, Japanese national spirit, because obviously there's Japanese movies. Let's find what we can do with what these movies are actually saying, and go into the quote-unquote nationalism or whatever people want to call it. But I'd call it the Japanese national spirit, but it's just the expression of Japanese society and what they're feeling at that time. And it's like a historical time capsule kind of, and depending on which movie, it's a bigger factor or a lesser factor, but it's still there. And that's what I want to try to do at Kaijuvision, is because once you get these Godzilla movies done, the choice was either to stick strictly to kaiju or to be like, hey, I want to stick with Japan, because that's foreign stuff. It's more obscure. There's more to dig up there. So that's why I went for stuff like Submersion of Japan. No kaiju, disaster movie. So awesome. I love it. And it says a lot about Japanese society at the time. And that's what I love. These cultural connections are what's so cool to me. That's so amazing because it's different and it's fun.
Well, the influences there, I mean, I'm not as strong on some of the cultural things, but just from purely a media perspective, you look at Submersion of Japan, and it's got so many of the same staff members who worked on the Godzilla movies at the time, but it looks tremendously different. And you look at the talent there, and then you look at what it went on to influence, and you'll find call-outs to Submersion of Japan and Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Yeah.
You had Shinji Higuchi direct the remake, which he then there are elements of there where you can be like, well, how does his portrayal of disaster in this affect his portrayal of disaster in Shin Godzilla or Attack on Titan, or any number of other things. So there's even those connections. But I mean, I'll freely admit, like, when I listen to your show, like I'll like, okay, he's talking about the movie, but I'm really looking forward to hearing him talk about like the third section where it's all the talk about the cultural stuff that is leading into the movie and what was going on there.
Coming up with a format like that was a daunting task that just kept exploding and snowballing into bigger and bigger. It just turned into this giant template, and I'm like, wow, how did I just do this? And it just came, and like that's what I love so much about being able to find a format that actually fits all of these movies, and you can just plug it in, because the Godzilla movies are so utterly different from each other. You can't relate them to each other just unless you got some kind of a process. But
well, and I mean, I'm curious, because I feel like there'll be times where like you'll have two movies that are really about, like, say, the student riots or something, and how do you choose which movie gets that coverage? And then if you have a movie where you feel like you've already talked about it, like, how do you come up with a new section for that?
Yeah, and like with the King of the Monsters, I'd already done environmentalism, and I'd already done extreme weather, even from Son of Godzilla. So I was like, wait a minute, eco-terrorists. And I remember going on to that, and I researched the subject back in graduate school, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. But then I read about it, and I was like, the story of I was radicalized on the internet is old. It's officially like an old story. Now, everybody's heard it. And it doesn't matter what it is, what kind of extremism. It almost doesn't matter anymore. And I just said when all terrorists are special, none of them are special. And it's just interesting. But I did like King of the Monsters enough. And I thought that eco-terrorism was, we got Alan Jonah. Let's do something with Alan Jonah. I thought, that's a cool character.
Have you watched the Scale episode of Godzilla the series? Oh, it's fantastic. Well, first of all, it's a found footage episode of a cartoon show from 1999.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's the cartoon, right?
Yeah. But it's all eco-terrorists. They break into Monster Island, and they're trying to free the monsters, and it's really good. It's
wow, I have to
written by one of the guys that's done a lot of X-Men comics. So.
That's quite amazing. I read Godzilla Aftershock.
Oh, okay.
The prequel graphic novel.
Right.
For King of the Monsters, and that was pretty good too. I like the art.
I was a little disappointed because he does that cool wave thing that comes off of his spines and that, and like I was hoping for something like that in the movie, and it's just sort of I mean the Mothra wings when he has a nuclear pulse is neat, but I'd like to see something really innovative, but that's because I was spoiled by Shin Godzilla.
Yeah, and this show was practically made for Shin Godzilla, right? Like it's a 3 hour and 15-minute long episode that just I couldn't stop writing.
Oh yeah.
Trying to find more and more levels of it, and it was political. It was just everything that I wanted.
Yeah, I'm no stranger to long podcast episodes. The craziest that we've done on Mazer Patrol was Justin Mullis and I sat down to talk about the influence of H.P. Lovecraft on Japanese pop culture, and then 8 hours later we finished recording. And I got on Facebook like, hey guys, would you prefer 1 8-hour episode? And was this immediately told no.
Yeah, the anime episode got out of control, and I was like, okay, we're doing 3 parts.
I love that episode.
I really loved that one too, and that the third anime movie just drove me crazy. I loved it so much. It was so dark and so just epic in that respect, and I love anime movies that make me cry at the end. I gotta say, I actually love movies that impact me that much that I'm like, hey, you got it. You totally did what I wanted you to do. But it was fun. I love how Ghidorah worked in that. But the whole Doom aspect was just perfect. I love all of the just attitude and atmosphere. It had a lot of atmosphere. So I'm going to get more to the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you consider yourself a hipster?
I don't. I mean, there's that famous webcomic, I can't remember who drew it, that's had the scale of hipster relativity, where nobody self-professes to be a hipster. That's just something that other people call them, and then one person can call another person a hipster, who will then call another person a hipster, and it's like this spectrum.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have a problem with that term, although I do, ironically, use the term ironically. So, but I think that there's definitely a case to be made that I tend to gravitate towards a lot of material that other people don't gravitate to, and I don't necessarily know that it's because other people don't gravitate to it that I do, but I think that it's something that I just think that there's a lot of things out there that are underappreciated and ought to be, and that does sort of it rubs me the wrong way a little bit, and I like. We don't need to talk about this right now anymore because everybody's talked about it. It's been talked about to death. Let's talk about this other thing that also has merits, and maybe it's not as good as that first thing, but I think everything should get its fair due. So
yeah, and give it a hearing and see how it lands, and just see where things go, and you just never know.
And the fringes is where you find the most interesting stuff.
The diamonds in the rough.
Yeah. I mean, let's look at the Godzilla franchise, and there's some weird stuff in the Godzilla franchise. Godzilla versus Hedorah is a weird movie. There's weird parts of Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. But
you don't say.
Yeah, you look at some of the manga, and it gets so there is a story where Godzilla is killed by a martial artist, and he is reincarnated as the baby of the martial artist, who then attacks the mother as revenge. There is a manga where Godzilla is a warrior, like sort of Thundercats style, where he goes on a rampage fighting the human world that's a parallel world, and all of the kaiju are like personified people. There is one of my favorite things in the whole world is this unmade Godzilla story from Nobuhiko Obayashi, the director of House, that is completely insane, and I apologize to everybody who listens to everything I say because I don't shut up about a space Godzilla, but it's for those who don't know, the idea was that Godzilla's corpse washes up on a beach having died of diabetes, and they determined that Godzilla was a space alien and she was pregnant, so they rebuild her body as a rocket ship, shoot it into space to go back to the Godzilla home planet. Upon reaching the Godzilla home planet, there's a revolution between the Godzilla species and a race of alien oppressors that are like Sphinx women with giant breasts. And their leader can vomit spiders, shoot flamethrowers from her breasts, and shoots shuriken shaped like swastika from her navel. And the fact that at some point Toho was considering doing this, granted it was in the 70s, is just amazing to me. And I wish that had happened. But on the other hand, I sort of understand that maybe that would have been too wild a timeline.
Yeah. The house is awesome.
Yes.
By the way, I love that.
I love it so much.
When you said the name, I was like, "How I know that? I know that name." Yeah. House. Wow.
Yeah, and that was something that people had. There was a lot of misinformation about it on the internet because I think a few people had the issue of Starlog that it ran in, and it was across multiple issues in the 70s. So maybe people had one issue, they had the other, but a lot of people don't speak Japanese at all, and they'd sort of make up a story to go with the illustrations, or they would make up things about the story. A lot of people say that it was written by Katsuhiro Otomo. In fact, it was illustrated by Katsuhiro Otomo, who went on to create Akira. But no, it was written by Obayashi. So that's another thing. Like you know about House. You know that's a crazy movie.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't, and they're just like, oh, well, this sounds like maybe they should have gotten Yoshimitsu Banno to direct. Like, no, I think Obayashi would have been perfectly crazy by himself.
Absolutely, yeah. He doesn't need any help.
Yeah.
He can create so many great things on the screen that I've never thought I'd ever see.
Yeah. So I mean, that case was, I managed to acquire those issues, and then my girlfriend is fluent in Japanese. She is a professional translator, and I just sort of asked her very, very nicely, and she decided that she was going to help me out and provide some translations for those, and now everybody knows about this story, and it's great.
Yeah, and you're getting something that nobody ever thought even existed, and you're saying, hey, this actually was the thing, and let's take a look at it and see how just amazing it was. I feel like sometimes I want to go back to like the 70s, which I wasn't even alive, but I want to go back there now in a way, and also the 60s.
Yeah.
But I would almost kill to be on the set of some of the Godzilla movies that they made in the 60s, just to be the fly on the wall and just watch the creative process happen and watch a movie, movies like that come together. and
be like, hey, Sanpo Sans, you're not doing what you said you did.
Do you think that part of hipster culture is about going back?
I think so. I mean, you look for the stuff that's been ignored, and you don't know that stuff has been ignored usually while it's happening. I think that there's a lot of stuff that sometimes you can see things happening like as it's going, and you're like, hey, more people should pay attention to this.
Yeah.
An example would be the comic series Kaiju Max. It's completely phenomenal. I don't know that every Kaiju fan is reading it, but they should be. However, a lot of stuff is you only really recognize it in retrospect, either because it was sort of big when it came out, and it just sort of fizzled away, or it's just completely been forgotten, and you go and you're like, hey, you remember this thing? A lot of people don't, and then you can introduce it to a new generation, and I think some people will specifically, I mean, especially with tokusatsu, because there's like such an emphasis on practical special effects and whatnot, and they're like, I won't watch anything with CGI in it, and then you are limited to like, okay, well, we just have this realm to mine, and then you can find those diamonds in the rough, your Orochi Strikes Again or something like that, where I think a lot of people would appreciate it if they could see it, but for the most part they can't. Right,
yeah. And one thing that I think delayed the release or the idea of this podcast was that I was examining things back in 2006. I bought every single Godzilla movie I could get my hands on, and it was about 2/3 of the ones that were around. And I thought, oh, I don't know if I can do this because people can't get a hold of them. And that made it difficult. And now that's not a problem. And now we're getting a hold of so many of these sort of second-level tokusatsu movies that were obscure, but now they're not as obscure because you can get a hold of them. And that's where the ones I've been doing lately, like Three Treasures, movies like that, and like, oh, great, now we can do these. And I want to keep going that direction and stay with Japan/Asia and keep mining there, because there's so much more to go. I mean, just like you have in your book, like even Bye Bye Jupiter is available now.
Yeah,
and you can get it, and tons of people are seeing it now. And talk about weird. That's going to be an amazing episode. But but then after that, what do you have after that? It's just another level of movies that you can go further with, whether they're kaiju or not.
Yeah, I mean, Bye Bye Jupiter was one I went to. The first time I saw it, I went to Video Search of Miami, which was a sketchy little bootleg place 20 years ago or so. And I got that, and I got My Soul is Slash, the Shusuke Kaneko movie at the same time. And that has still not gotten any sort of U.S. release. So even then, there's still plenty of things that don't get picked up. And then it's interesting to see, like, people I think are a little bit more familiar with Bye Bye Jupiter because of the Discotheque release. And I'll also admit that I don't watch everything ever made. Like, there are some things that I don't see until they get an official release.
Yeah.
So it's sort of selfish a lot of the time when I'm like, come on guys, let's put this out. And that's also why, I mean, I'm in the extreme minority about this, but a lot of people are super excited for the, like, Criterion Godzilla box set. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I got all the Godzilla movies. The Criterion has Princess from the Moon. They have 100 Shot, 100 Killed. They have these interesting movies that they're just sitting on doing nothing. I don't want another Blu-ray of Godzilla. So, yeah.
I seem to remember having some discs with Godzilla on them. Yeah. and it's great that's happening and stuff, but I agree with you. I'm just that's great and stuff, but okay, let's keep going.
Yeah, and I fully understand why the companies behave this way. Like, they're gonna sell what people buy, and the Godzilla titles are evergreen, and certain other things that get re-released are evergreen. But it's just that desire to plumb the depths and really find the things that you haven't seen before. That's where it's getting really exciting. And it's Matt Greenfield was here a few years ago, and he's a gentleman and a scholar, but he was talking about what they're releasing from Section 23 films. They put out Return of Godzilla on Blu-ray, and he's like, I would put out Bruba, but nobody's going to watch Bruba. And I'm like, the fact that you have heard of Bruba, I applaud, sir.
And once I finish more episodes of what I'm working on now, I need to see more obscure things and find ways to appreciate those, because it's like getting finding a box somewhere, and you bring the box in and you're like, hey, let's look in this and figure out what's in it.
Yeah,
and examine it.
For kaiju stuff, that was a big part of the idea behind the book, was that people can look at a list of Godzilla movies, and they can look at a list of Gamera movies, and even the other Toho kaiju films are fairly well documented.
Yes.
But I think a lot of times there's stuff that just completely passes people by. The number of people I run into that have not seen Daimajin blows my mind. And those movies are fantastic. And The Magic Serpent is fantastic. And Love and Peace is fantastic. And these are movies that people should see. And I really want, some of them have legit U.S. releases, and some of them don't. And the more people talk about them, the better the chances of them getting releases are. So,
yeah, it's a conundrum, because nobody's seeing it, so it's not being produced. And it's like, well, it's because nobody's seen it, so you have to get them to see it first before we can actually get the ball rolling, and that can be difficult. And foreign films are. That's another barrier.
It's a hard sell, especially in America, as it currently is. There is a period where a lot more Japanese movies were coming out. I don't know fully if it was because they share a Blu-ray region code now, and because of that licensing is difficult, or if there's simply not as much of a market as there was before the economic crisis, or quite what the situation is. But definitely you're companies like Tokyo Shock still exist, but they're not putting out the volume that they used to.
Right.
And Discotheque is starting to turn around, and they're putting out Just Beyond, which is fantastic, but they're also not putting out like the weird cult movies that they were once putting out, and I've asked them about that, and they have flat out said that they had no interest in it. So I'm not purely speculating about these things.
Right. Yeah. One of the main ideas behind the show is comparative politics, because I went to Indiana University Bloomington School of Public and Environmental Affairs. It's ranked higher than the Maxwell School at Syracuse, and it's ranked higher than the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And it's a wonderful school. I learned so much. And comparative politics is so cool because by examining others, you learn to examine more about yourself. And by looking at movies like Shin Godzilla, you learn more about America. When you turn around and look at American movies, you find it more. And like, I know that there was a complaint about nationalism and stuff in Shin Godzilla, and I was like, well, wait, this might be just patriotism, guys. There's a difference. And then I look at King of the Monsters, and I'm like, this is a... if I was a Japanese person, or more like anybody else outside America, I might think this movie was a tad militaristic. And like at the beginning where they're like, we don't want to be a branch of the military at the beginning, and then yet they behave completely like a branch of the military.
We want to have all of the jets and planes and tanks. We just don't want the supervision.
Yeah.
There are definitely elements there, and I understand that there are people smarter than myself that have made many cases about such things, and I'm friends with some of the people who had the Godzilla nationalism panel from last year. I don't necessarily agree with everything that was brought up on that panel, but I think that that's a nice thing that we can, sort of discuss it in a civil manner. And then,
yes, they brought up points that are a way to jumpstart the conversation, at least.
Yeah.
Because if you don't discuss it at all and you don't address it, then it just sits there and just festers. And there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, I think that the danger is that sometimes people get very aggressive when certain subjects are brought up, and there's a lot of hyperbole. I mean, just in general I think it's not unique to this fandom. I think every fandom has a lot of hyperbole, but then it can quickly devolve into factions of people, pro or against, and then if there's one thing that you don't like about a movie, then it becomes all elements of the movie are bad and wicked, and that tends to bother me a lot as well. I mean, there are certainly movies that I am completely against, but there are many. I try to see the good parts in everything, and that gets me. I have sometimes a reputation when I say like, the Sayonara Jupiter is about 2.5 stars, and people look at me like I'm insane and have 4 heads or something. So,
yeah, I don't know if I've ever said no way when watching a movie so many times to myself. when I watched Bye Bye Jupiter, it's like no way, as in this is so awesome. I can't believe this is happening on the screen right now. But the reason I wanted to have you on is because you're clearly into going deeper. You're going into the obscure, and so you have something in common with one of the many missions of this show, which is to go deeper, particularly in the direction of international relations, macro trends of history, and looking at Japanese history, world history, American history sometimes, but usually it's something Japanese. And there's so much more to go, and 50 episodes is... I might end up looking back on it and being like, 50 episodes is nothing. But I could go another 50.
I did some really weird research tangents while I was working on the book. I went down a rabbit hole of cryptozoology while I was researching Legend of Dinosaurs and Monster Birds. I wound up looking at the history of Japanese gas stations when I was researching Ultraman's Earth. So it is interesting to see how things sort of tie together. I mean, mostly, I focus on media in and of itself a lot of the time, and I think it's another blind spot that people have is, you have your fans of tokusatsu and your fans of animation, and they don't tend to cross over as much as I would perhaps like, and so many things influence each other one way or another, and I think that's a wealthy area to explore, is look at even like how American and British science fiction has influenced Japanese science fiction. You know, like I said, we did a 8-hour episode about H.P. Lovecraft in Japan, but you could, you know, take a look at, you know, numerous other Western authors and see how they've influenced Japanese pop culture, and then vice versa. You know, in recent years, you do get more anime-ized forms of things like Elysium, for an example. When I first saw the trailer, I was like, is this Battle Angel Alita? Well, you know, it's sort of. Or Avatar, biggest movie ever made still, I think. I haven't checked the running with Avengers Endgame.
Yeah, it was like
recently.
neck and neck there.
Yeah, but I mean, that movie, I feel there's so much anime all over that.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty interesting too. I have a recommendation for you. There is some kaiju content. It's not a movie, but the TV show Concrete Revolution is fantastic. It's an anime series, but it's sort of set in an alternate Showa era where all of the superheroes and kaiju and things are real, but you also have all of the you know, left-wing terrorist attacks and the cultural revolution. There's an episode where the Beatles show up and give people superpowers. Like it's just full of weird things like that it's great to look at from a like, okay, so this is referencing Gecko Common, and this is Astro Boy, but it's also Sputnik, and it's really neat to just go through and see how the wires connect across the actual history of the Showa period, and then all of the pop culture getting woven together in this narrative.
That sounds really fascinating.
Yeah,
it's definitely take a look at that. And that's another thing with like the Japanese fandom is how it's different than like the kaiju fandom here, because over here it's all sectioned off. Mm-hmm. Like, and meanwhile in Japan it's like anime, kaiju, more things like that put together, and they cross over. Interest crosses over with each other. Yeah. And maybe one reason why the anime movies didn't do so well here was just because, as opposed to just the cartoon from the 90s, this was a totally different beast, really. And we're crossing into a different genre for once in Godzilla like this that is unprecedented, and we're treating them as Godzilla movies, even though this could have just been a series.
Yeah, well, that's always the context, and we get these movies devoid of context, and I understand why. If you get Invasion of Astro Monster on a DVD, and you get Godzilla vs. Gigan on a DVD, and you think, okay, these are both movies that came out and they were direct to DVD, why are these not the same quality?
Yeah.
And that is not how they were envisioned and not how they were produced. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really the big factor to keep in mind. And it's the same thing with the Netflix movies. They were designed for Netflix. Mm-hmm. They were released in theaters in small runs, but they were not intended to be the successor to Shin Godzilla or anything like that. They were placeholders while they were waiting to get the rights to work on another movie.
Yes, yeah, and that's the thing. Like some of these Godzilla movies, I really wish that like we had like a Japanese person just come here from Toho and just be like, okay, this is the purpose of this, and this is different now than the thing you saw before. Everybody calm down. Just, it's different, all right? Just trust me.
To an extent, we get that sometimes.
And I loved when, but Shinji Higuchi, I loved when he introduced Shin Godzilla. He said how, okay, everybody, this movie was made for Japanese people. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's like, put it right out there, because it's all about 3/11, or a huge amount of it is, and disasters, and just the entire psyche behind 3/11, and just all that, and researching 3/11 was so amazing. And I remember when it happened, and the all-encompassing hugeness of it was just unfathomable. I can't imagine something like that happening in America. I just can't. One day it very well could.
I think that's something that gets lost on a lot of people, not on everybody, but just how much 311 stuff is involved with Shin Godzilla. I mean, the
whole moving thing, and the whole going dormant, and all of that explains it.
The movie is literally about a bunch of people sacrificing themselves to shut down a nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
So, and it speaks volumes that the other major hit from Toho that year, I mean, the highest grossing movie in Japan that year was Your Name, which was also a lot about 311. It was less blatantly so, but it was tapping into the same psychological trauma. It's again about a big natural disaster and people trying to save other people from that natural disaster. So, I mean, that's a case where, I mean, they're talking about a U.S. remake of it, and I don't understand what the...
What?
Well, I mean, there's also the U.S. remake of Akira, which is just completely inane. That's a terrible idea and has always been one.
Yeah. I was kind of scared when that...
You can't get much more Japanese than Akira.
No, you can't.
Yeah, sometimes you can find resources super easily. It depends on what you're looking up. You know, for old movies, it tends to be things that had major releases. You can find information very easily. For certain other things, you sort of have to speculate a little bit.
Yeah.
And the hardest are things from like the straight to VHS era, because a lot of that was not particularly well documented.
And probably the preservation was an issue too.
Yep, that is definitely it.
And I know about what's been going on in Europe with all of these movies that were made in Europe that were old, and then all of the films degrading, and there's not enough time to save them all. You know, like Criterion can only grab so many of these things and turn them into DVDs, and
God, the entirety of Southeast Asia just makes me cry a little bit, because I look at, you know, movies from Taiwan like War God, and like, this is amazing. Why is the best print of this terrible? Another one was so anyway, there's another movie that I found that there was the English dub, but there wasn't an original Chinese audio track that I found. However, I did find the English dub with Chinese subtitles, which suggests that the Chinese original language version is just completely gone. So that's
wow.
That's frustrating.
Yeah.
And Japan is pretty good about this stuff, but other countries are just not as much. However, a lot of these other countries had the Japanese talent from Tsuburaya and Toho come over and work on these things, and it's just not well preserved. I mean, ironically, one of the better ones in terms of film preservation is probably Pulgasari, because that's something where there's a lot of baggage behind Pulgasari, so you're gonna have fun with that episode whenever you get to it.
Yes, I have read up on some of it. Yeah, the gist of it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a great book called The Kim Jong-il Production that it just sort of goes through not that movie specifically, but the entire Shinsanok struggle. So.
Yeah, and there's so much history to mine there too.
Yeah.
That's some of these movies are absolutely perfect for this kind of a format because of the history and or politics that was surrounding it at the time. And that's always so interesting to me, because we can't, otherwise, like you said, everything's about context, and if you lose the context, then it just becomes meaningless.
Right. And I don't know, as somebody who's completely devoid of context, you know, some movies are going to still work for them. Like, I think you can still watch you could watch Love and Peace regardless. I mean, that's a very sort of straightforward movie, but if you watch, say, Jellyfish Eyes, you're just going to be like, well, okay, there is a tsunami and now there's a cult, and why are these monsters like this, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of reading to I mean, that's one reason why we had an entire podcast episode just talking about Takashi Murakami. So which I then turned into a chapter in the book. So no need to do both. If you want to just listen to the podcast or read the chapter, you know, either way works.
Absolutely. The way you tackle the movies, the way you approach them is so unique, and it adds another voice and another perspective, and that's what's so very much needed, is to go off the beaten path and find something interesting that hasn't been discovered as much as it should be.
Yeah, and the way I write, I tend to just sort of geek out. I sort of write in the same way that I would as if I were speaking with somebody, only perhaps with fewer pauses and stutters and whatnot. I don't try to be particularly academic, but there's definitely times where I'll just like rattle off 20 movie titles because that's the way my brain works sometimes. And I definitely research things before writing them and to try to put the most salient ideas in and little anecdotes and things like that, whatever I think is going to be most entertaining. But I don't have I wasn't going with a strict structure. You know, sometimes you'll have sets of reviews where like, all right, this is the plot synopsis, this is the thoughts about the breakdown of this scene, I'm just like, I'll see what happens when I start writing. It's very stream of conscious, but I think it worked out okay for a lot of these. Sometimes I'll go back and be like, oh man, that was great. Why can't I write like that anymore?
And that, listeners, is Kevin Derendorf, who I've wanted to see for a couple years now since I started coming to G-Fest. And he was on 17 panels this time around this year, and I know I could never do that. It's actually 6, but that may as well be 17. So,
right.
And it's so important to have you here, and it's this whole conference is such an amazing event, and I look forward to it in my own messed up way, where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna see more things that I haven't before, and meet people that are actually on the same wavelength, because that's not always the case, for sure. And maybe the Godzilla and Kaiju community is a niche audience. I don't really know about that term, because it shouldn't be a niche audience necessarily, but it's just that we're so surrounded by so much media that we're all overwhelmed.
I think there's a lot of people who are sort of casually into kaiju stuff, and then there's the people that definitely are much more into it. So if you look at like the entire audience for, Shin Godzilla, for an example, a lot of people went to go see that movie. That said, you know, the number of people who are very, very into stuff like this is not that huge. I mean, we're looking at record-breaking attendance for this convention, which is only about 4,500 to 6,000 people. I've heard the estimates for this particular set of days, but that's still only a fraction. I know a lot of people who are very into the stuff who are just not coming to the convention, and I would encourage anyone who is out there and on the fence about whether they should attend G-Fest to come and give it a try. And there's panels, there's shopping, there's movie screenings, there's the Pickwick, where you can see all of the whatever Toho movie you've been meaning to see on the big screen, but you can also go to the film festival here and see some really weird things, and that's
and it's just movies running all day long.
Yep.
And there's, when I first heard about G-Fest, I had no idea how much stuff there was. Mm-hmm. It's way more than I thought, and especially the panels. There's so many awesome panels put together about so many amazing subjects, and it's all quite academic, a lot of it at least. And it helps you think on a different level about it, and makes you appreciate it, and the more levels you can appreciate something, the better it gets. Right, well, thank you very much for coming in, and now we can get back to the convention, and I can get back to writing, and I will see you at the Godzilla anime movie panel, which should be fun.
All right, looking forward to that. Let's make some enemies.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for coming in, Kevin, and we will see you later at the convention. Take care. And that concludes our interview. I'd like to send a shout out to our patrons, Kyoe Toshi and Sean Stiff. Thank you for your support. I really appreciate it. Donating is worth it. You get the inside track to what's going on in the show, and you get to message with me personally. If you'd like to send some feedback, I'd love to hear from you. The email address is feedback@kaijuvision.com. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Kaijuvision Radio is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Blueberry, TuneIn, Podcast Addict, YouTube with scenic videos, and on kaijuvision.com. If you like the podcast, please check out Patreon. I'm Brian Scherschel, and this is KVR Kaijuvision Radio. See you next time.